Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Oblong Online. I'm Susanna Hermans, co-owner of Oblong Books, independent booksellers in New York's Hudson Valley. This event is part of our Hudson Valley YA Society series, an author event series that we've been producing for the last 11 years. Tonight, we're thrilled to host four incredible authors who have written some deliciously romantic books: Sheba Karim, Alexis Nedd, Emiko Jean, and Kelly Loy Gilbert. I'm going to introduce our authors and then we'll get down to business. Sheba Karim is the author of Miriam Sharma Hits the Road, That Thing We Call a Heart, and Skunk Girl. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and NYU School of Law and currently lives in Nashville. You can visit her online at shebakarim.com. In The Marvelous Mirza Girls, Noreen meets kind, handsome Kabir, who introduces her to the wonders of India's magical, complicated, most polluted city. With the help of Kabir, plus Bollywood celebrities, 14th century ruins, karaoke parties, and Sufi saints, Noreen discovers new meanings for home. Alexis Ned is a Brooklyn-based pop culture anthropologist who only ever loved things in a big, obsessive way. As the senior entertainment reporter at Mashable, she covers television, movies, and video games. In her new book, Don't Hate the Player, Jake Hooper has had a crush on Amelia since he was 10 years old. When his underdog esports team makes it into the tournament, he's floored to discover she's been leading a double life. The fates bring Jake and Amelia together as they work to keep her secret, even as the pressures of the tournament and their non-gaming world threaten to pull everything apart. Emiko Jean's Tokyo Ever After is a New York Times bestseller and a Reese Witherspoon Hello Sunshine book club pick, and #1 Indie Next Pick. I think of this as the Triple Crown. Izumi travels to Japan to meet the father she never knew and discover the country she always dreamed of. But being a princess isn't all ball gowns and tiaras. There are conniving cousins, a hungry press, a scowling but handsome bodyguard who just might be her soulmate, and thousands of years of tradition and customs to learn practically overnight. Emiko is the author of Empress of All Seasons and Will Never Be Apart. Before she became a writer, she was an entomologist, a candle maker, a florist, and most recently, a teacher. Kelly Loy Gilbert believes deeply in the power of stories to illuminate a shared humanity and give voice to complex, broken people. She's the author of Conviction, a William C. Morris Award finalist, and Picture Us in the Light, and lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. In When We Were Infinite, all Beth wants is for her tight-knit circle of friends to stay together. With her family splintered and her future a question mark, these friends are all she has, even if she sometimes wonders if she truly fits in with them. If you have questions for our authors at any time during the event, throw them into the chat or use the Ask a Question module at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to go in the order that I just said. So Sheba, you're up first. You want to tell us about your book?
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm the author of The Marvelous Mirza Girls, and I forgot to bring a copy of the book with me today because it's been one of those weeks. But The Marvelous Mirza Girls is a love story and a love letter to the city of New Delhi. And it's about a young woman named Noreen Mirza. And when the book opens, she's graduated from high school and her aunt has died a year earlier, but Noreen still can't quite get over her grief and is kind of flummoxed as to why it's so hard for her to, why she's grieving her aunt so much, why she doesn't feel like herself. And she's very close to her mother. And this book was loosely inspired by the show Gilmore Girls, if there are any Gilmore Girls fans out there. So she's very close to her mother, and her mother gets an opportunity to move to New Delhi, India for work for a few months. And Noreen decides to defer college a year and move to New Delhi with her mom. And while in New Delhi, she has various adventures, but the primary one is she meets Kabir, who's this kind, handsome fellow, and he shows her around Delhi, and they fall in love. And one thing I was interested in exploring in this book is what you can learn about yourself when you leave the place that you live and go to an entirely new place, and also what that experience of both falling in love with a person while also falling in love with this new city, and how those sort of two loves inform each other. And also, you know, New Delhi is an amazing city. It's also a very complicated city, and it's not a very easy city necessarily to be a woman in. So sort of the contradictions and like complicated ways in which Noreen, you know, falls in love, grows into herself, gains her voice back, you know, becomes a more sexual person, learns all these things, while at the same time navigating a society that can also be very misogynistic, and how those two things can happen concurrently. So, yeah, that's it.
Okay, great. I'm just going to switch us over to bring Alexis back.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexis Ned. This is Don't Hate the Player, my debut novel. It just came out last month. Don't Hate the Player is a YA esports romance. I'm a big video game person. I play them for work. I play them all the time. And I wanted to write a romance that captured the kind of feelings that can come up when you spend time with someone online playing games, because you can build really good, you know, friendships and more than friendships there. The premise of the story is that we have Amelia Romero. She's up here on the cover in the purple. And she is a Puerto Rican know-it-all, super high-strung, straight-A student whose parents have really, really high expectations of her when it comes to school, sports, everything. And that's fine, but what she actually loves is to play an online game called Guardians League Online, and she sneaks it whenever she can, and she's really, really good at it. So good that she ends up at this tournament for a pretty big pool of money, where she runs into Jay Cooper, a guy at her school who's actually had a crush on her for years. Don't Hate the Player it deals with a lot of the good and bad parts of being a gamer, especially with multiplayer games online, because Amelia is a woman of color in gaming, just like me. And it's not always the safest and most supportive place for women and people of color, specifically if you happen to be both or any other marginalized identity. So there's a lot of her experience in dealing with that and learning how to trust someone with, one, her biggest secret, and that she's actually this gamer, and with her heart as well, because she has a very hard exterior from her experiences online. And she just happens to meet the one little nerd who just might melt the icy outside and find all the soft, gooey stuff in the middle.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alexis. And let me bring up Emiko. Getting there. There we go.
Here I am. Hi, everyone. I am Emiko Jean, the author of Tokyo Ever After. Tokyo Ever After is all about Azumi Tanaka, who lives in a small, mostly white Northern California town with her single mom. And even though she has a great relationship with her mom, Azumi desires to know her father and connect more with her cultural heritage. Through a series of very, very fortunate events and some clever friends, she finds out that her father is really the crown prince of Japan. And this kicks off her journey to Japan, to Tokyo, to get to know the father that she's always wanted to, and the country that she's always dreamed of. The story is full of glitz and glamour, based loosely on The Princess Diaries, but at its heart, it's really about someone searching for where they belong, and about the Japanese American experience.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And let's get Kelly back.
Yay. Hi. Yay. I'm Kelly Loy Gilbert. My most recent book is When We Were Infinite. Sorry, I think it's backwards. And it's, this is, I would have to say, the book of my heart. I started writing this book, gosh, almost like 15 years ago. Long enough ago that like the first draft, nobody had cell phones or email. It was all just like landlines, and they were like writing these like notes to each other. And it's a story about a girl named Beth. She's growing up in also Northern California. And she has this really tight-knit group of friends who she leans on really, really heavily in the wake of her parents' divorce. She's kind of created a found family out of these friends that she has. And she's especially connected to one of them. His name is Jason, and she's been in love with him kind of all her life. The five of them are in this really prestigious youth orchestra together. And so they have this bond that's kind of based on music as well as, you know, all the sort of inside jokes and layers and histories to their friendship. And I remember one time my best friend saying that she felt like high school was about figuring out like how deep you can go with another person, and like young adulthood is like trying to figure out boundaries. So it's kind of these like polar opposites. And I think that's definitely true of this book. It's really a story about Beth trying to sort of figure out how deep she can go with Jason, with her friends. And I think the question sort of at the heart of the book is how are ways that you can give of yourself without losing yourself? How do you have these people that you need and love without sort of losing who you are? And it's a story about how when she learns something terrible is happening to Jason and he kind of goes into this really dark period of his life, how she gets sort of caught up in that and has to find a way to sort of navigate that in a way that leads to a lot of change and upheaval and also eventually growth in her life.
Wonderful. All right. Let's get everybody back. Takes a minute to get everybody back. Hang on. Okay, so the thing I want to talk about first is we sort of like cheatingly a little bit pitched this event as a romance event, even though like not all of your books I would say are like full on romances, but they all have romantic storylines in them. So can you guys talk a little bit about why you chose to include a romance in your story and how you wrote it? In whatever order you'd like to talk.
We missed the last part of your question because you went out a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. My question was, what made you decide to include a romance in your story, and how did you choose to write that romance?
Okay.
Without spoilers, of course.
Crucial missing word. Got it.
I'll go first, I guess. So my romance was there from the beginning of the story. There is a hot bodyguard in the book, and I'm a big fan of the hot bodyguard trope to begin with, so I knew I wanted to include that. And he's very much the embodiment of Japan and this world that she's entering, the imperial family and everything. So in a way, he really helped her on her journey, on Izumi's journey to figuring out her Japanese heritage and exploring it. And I drafted the romance mostly as, originally I would say it was an enemies to friends to lovers, but now that I go back and I look at the book again, it's more of an opposites because they're coming from two different cultures, and then to friends, and then eventually it leads to romance.
You guys rather I call people out instead of making this bigger. I'm so sorry. How about Alexis?
Sure. And Don't Hate the Player, it was always going to be a love story for me. I see it as like a love story on a couple different levels, because it's about how much Amelia loves the game that she's playing. It's about Amelia and Jake falling in love. It's about finding out how to love yourself, especially from Jake's perspective, because he's got a lot of confidence issues and he kind of works his way through them and getting to know this girl better. And I wanted to write the romance in a way where it's, they're gamers, they're having fun, and they're kids doing what they like to do, but it's also kind of about the mortifying ordeal of being known. Because when you're that young, you're figuring yourself out, and to find someone who not only sees all of you and is like, yeah, the good parts, the bad parts, like I'm actually super into this because you don't really want to show somebody the sort of scarier or bad parts of you because you think that they won't like you. But the flip side of that is also sometimes it's even scarier to show someone the things you like about yourself and the things that you think are positive and have them think that those things are good too. Like, I think those things can almost be equally as scary. So for Amelia, the things that she's been hiding are the things she likes about herself. And she's so scared to show somebody that I'm good at this and I like doing this, that to have someone who's like, yeah, and that's really cool is mind-blowing. So I wanted to have that kind of push-pull between the two characters because Jake as well, you know, he's a nervous wreck. He's, you know, stuttery all over the place, but he's really earnest and he's really empathetic, and he thinks that makes him weak, especially in the gamer world. And to see a girl who's like, yeah, no, I really like that about you, is just like this constant boosting of you know, their egos, which can be good in certain ways. And I wanted to have the romance be like each one builds a little rung of a ladder and they can reach the top together, but they couldn't do it alone. And it's never by tearing each other down. It's always just by building each other up and discovering new good things about each other mutually.
Excellent. Kelly?
Yeah, I love what you said, Alexis, about like framing it as like a love story. I feel like mine isn't quite a romance because it doesn't follow like the conventions of like the genre, but I definitely feel like it is similarly, I guess, a love story between both the group of friends at large and also I think just a person learning to figure out how to like authentically love other people and another person, and also how to sort of extend that to yourself. I think that's something that a lot of people I knew when I was young, that was like such a huge question mark in our lives. Like what does that look like? How do you do that? And so that was something I really wanted to explore. And I think I also was, I was really interested in the idea of writing these two characters who saw each other very much at their worst and at kind of the lowest and hardest points in their lives. And I think even in some ways their relationship was a little bit toxic. And I think I was interested in the question of whether you can redeem that. Like, is there still hope and a chance there? Like, is there redemption in that? I think especially when the characters are young, I think that's something that people sort of have to learn to navigate. We're just all kind of figuring out, you know, how to be people, I guess. And so that was something I really wanted to kind of dive deep in, is what does that look like between people? How do you kind of hold those histories and those pasts between you, and what can you do with them, both sort of with the two of them, Beth and Jason, and also just kind of as a larger group?
Sheba?
Yeah, so I set out to write a love story, and this is the first for me in terms of like conceiving of a novel. It's like, I'm going to write a love story. And I knew that I wanted to set it in Delhi, which is a city that, you know, I've lived in for a number of years and is very close to my heart. And I think part of what I wanted to explore is, you know, in the book, Noreen is 18 and Kabir, her boyfriend, is 25. So, you know, they're a bit older, and they actually, Kabir there's a family scandal, and they're both really just they're very good-hearted people. So part of it was just the joy of writing two people with like, you know, who are flawed but have very good hearts, like finding one another in this like crazy world. But, you know, so he has a family scandal, and he kind of hits a low. And I think I wanted to explore one thing that I don't think is talked about enough, just in society in general, like not even, but like how love and relationships are such hard work. And it's like a push and pull and a give and take. And like Kelly was saying, you also want to maintain your sense of self in a relationship. So Noreen finds herself in a position where, you know, initially she's like, oh, everything was going wonderful, and this terrible thing happened and now everything is ruined. And then she's like, okay, no, wait, you know, this is what love is. Someone's going through something and you have to like be there for them. And what does that mean? And how do you support someone while also doing self-care and all of that? So just sort of exploring that, you know, after you get serious, because I think there's still a lot of like just general Disney stuff in our society where, you know, you think, oh, you meet the person and then boom, boom, you fall in love. And like most romantic comedies end, right, where they're like getting married and everything's going to be like smooth sailing. And you're like, actually, no, there's going to be like people change, and if you're together for years and years, like, you know, people develop new interests, new passions, and you have to adjust. And so this is kind of a mini, you know, younger exploration of like the passion of falling in love, but also realizing, you know, it takes work and communication and like supporting each other to like have a good, healthy relationship.
Beautiful. I just celebrated my first wedding anniversary last week, so I feel very much the things you're saying, especially after a year of quarantine with your partner. You know, so it's a test. It's a test, but I think we're doing well. So our Hudson Valley YA Society series tends to attract folks who are maybe writers themselves or aspiring writers. So we like to talk a lot about craft and publication, maybe more than other event series do. But can you guys each talk a little bit about the craft of writing this book, including maybe what your writing process is, if you're like a outliner or not, or if you know, write every day, that kind of stuff. We'll go maybe backwards order this time. So Sheba.
Yeah, so I love structure, and so I'm very much a structuralist. So I like to have an outline, not necessarily of the whole book, but at least with like the first few chapters as I'm writing, with the understanding that in revision, that like the Marvelous Mirrors Girl started out with like this fantasy element in it, and like it changed so much over revision, but I still had to have that an outline, even though I know that outline's going to change, and then I re-outline and re-outline and re-outline. So something about having like a structure initially, and then I write that draft, and then I have to re-outline and then revise, and so I like to outline first. In terms of writing process, I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, so basically when they're in school / daycare, that's the only time I have to write, and so it's very much like, you know, weekdays, you know, daylight hours, and just being, and I teach writing as well, which is always I think interesting when you teach writing, you're telling your students these various things, and I think that ingrains it in you too. I'm telling my students like to do this and that, or to watch for this, or to think about this. So I should do it too, right? Like I need to be doing this as well. And so I think that also because I started teaching when I was writing the first draft of this book, and I think actually teaching writing really like informed like new possibilities for me, and like ways I could write and conceive of my book. So that was an interesting kind of synergy going on there.
Kelly?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always so wished actually I could be like you, Sheba, and do like the outlining. And I don't know, something about whenever I try, like I feel like for me, the process of like conceiving what a story is going to be about, and then I feel like when I do that, it's like maybe more plot driven. And then when I start to write, I always realize again, like I'm so not a plot person, no matter how much I try. And like everything I write is always like super, super character driven. So whenever I try to outline, I feel like I either like write myself into these corners. I remember in my last book, the book was set in the city, in the San Francisco Bay Area, like in a suburb. And I'd like gotten to myself to this point where like the only way out of the situation was like I had to write in this bear attack, and it's like literally the suburbs. I was like, this is not working. So I feel like so now I've kind of tried to embrace more starting from a place of like character. I think that's a little more effective for me personally. And I think one of the big things that I always try to start with is figuring out the particular lens that the narrator is kind of looking through. So for this book, music is a really, really big one. And so I did a lot of sort of like writing exercises where I was thinking about, you know, like if she's like walking through the airport or whatever, like how is that informed by her sense of like musicality, you know, what is the experience like for her to be like this one person in this like 60-person orchestra, like, you know, and thinking about how maybe she feels a lot of safety in that. And in a way that when it's just her, she feels kind of really different and sort of not as secure in that. And then the other lens for her was this kind of fear of aloneness after her parents split up and her dad left and sort of is not involved in her life anymore. and how that sort of is really deeply at the core of kind of everything she thinks and everything she does in ways that she doesn't really want to access or admit to herself yet. And so craft-wise, I think trying to sort of view everything through those lenses and figuring out what those lenses are for all the other characters and how those play together. And I would say one of my big craft challenges for this book was the main character, she's really kind of passive in a way, just because of the ways that she's like scarred and fearful. And she is very insecure and kind of has this belief too that if she can make herself sort of small enough and, you know, not need anything from people, not want anything or take up too much space, that's how she's gonna make people never leave her. And on a craft level, it's sort of really hard to have this main character who's like waiting for things to happen to her rather than driving them herself. So trying to figure out ways that for her felt really true to who she was, that were driving the plot, but that also felt like they were actions she would realistically take, sort of given all her like psychological constraints, I guess.
Alexis?
As far as specific craft or process goes, I'm definitely an outliner. For full disclosure, Don't Hate the Player is actually based on an outline by a production company called Assemble Media, who back then it was called Player versus Player, and they were looking for a writer to sort of write a novel based on the album that they had. And when they basically took me on to write the novel, the first 3 chapters of the book was pretty much what they wanted, and then the rest I ended up kind of just like tweaking every bit of the outline until it was completely unrecognizable. Because I'm much better at tweaking than I am at generating. So even when I'm doing my own work that's not based on anyone else's idea, it's a lot of, I just have to get something out, even if the outline is terrible, because I know I'm going to change it, but just having it physically there and knowing, okay, I don't know, but I can just, change that part and then change that part. But it has to exist for me to change it. Because just going off to the races is not how my brain works at all. I have a very chaotic mind. I definitely am more of a write in fits and bursts kind of person, because my full-time job is actually writing. And it got pretty rough towards the middle of writing this book, because I was going to work every day and writing, and then coming home every day and writing. I had got carpal tunnel. It was not great.
No.
But yeah, it's more of, and because that really stressed me out a lot. This is my debut novel, so I didn't know if that was normal or fine. And that stressed me out so much that now that I'm working on my second novel, what I've learned is that I kind of have to take the ebbs and flows of time and creativity that I have and capitalize on them, rather than try and push myself to be like, you're going to do a chapter today, because then my brain is a petulant child and it will say, no, I'm not doing anything. I want to play Zelda. So, and then I end up playing Breath of the Wild for 6 hours. So it really is more of like a coaxing, accepting the chaos and riding the wave sort of thing for me, which I understand is not very helpful from an advice perspective, but maybe there's another chaos monkey out there, who knows?
That's great. Emiko?
So I am a hardcore outliner. And I didn't start that way. So with my debut, We'll Never Be Apart, I wrote by the seat of my pants. I'm sure everyone's heard like Pantser versus, what is it? Pantser versus Plotzer, right? Did I get that right? Yeah, okay. So I wrote by the seat of my pants, We'll Never Be Apart. And gosh, I think I revised it like 20 or 30 times, a lot. And so I learned the hard way. And my next book, Empress of All Seasons, I did kind of like a little outline where I wrote out chapter beats. And then with Tokyo Ever After, I really nailed down the outline for it. And that helped a lot. I cut my revision time down to like six revisions, which seems like a lot, but I felt like that was really successful. And with Tokyo Ever After, I had one of those like rare lightning bolt writing moments where I saw Azumi's character arc in 1 minute. So I knew like where she was starting, and I knew where I wanted her to end up. And that doesn't always happen. It certainly didn't happen with my first 2 novels. I had to kind of uncover layer by layer the character arcs. So I feel very fortunate that that happened with Tokyo. Anyways, I can't remember. I'm trying to think about Tokyo Ever After. I think it took me, I sold it on partial, and then it took me about 18 months to finish the rest of the draft. So I wrote the first like 10 chapters of it and a synopsis, and then we sold it that way.
That's great. That leads really nicely into my next question, which was about path to publication. Do you have anything you want to add? Like path to publication, including like how long it took you to start to write the book and how long between when you basically finished it and it actually came out?
Yeah. So I sold Tokyo Ever After on partial, and which was kind of terrifying then once you sell it and you're like, oh my God, I have to write this thing. So I sold it, and then it took me about 18 months to finish it up, and then a year for the whole production process. So that's like the book going to line edits with your editor and copy edits and then cover art and all that kind of stuff. So this book has been like 2.5 years in the making. My other two books, my previous two books, I sold as full manuscripts, so it was a little bit of a shorter timeline. It was about 1.5 years. But between that, you know, there were lots of ups and downs. I had like one, I always like to mention this too, especially if there's other writers out there. I sold my first book in a 2-book contract, and the second book, I wrote a whole second book. It was a YA thriller, and it was rejected by the publisher. They were like, oh, we don't think this is good. I mean, that's what I heard. They said it in a much nicer way. But so it was completely devastated, and I had to recover from that. And I ended up writing another book to fulfill the contract, which was Empress of All Seasons. But, you know, what I like to tell other writers is that there's a lot of rejection kind of at the beginning of the process. And then there's more too when you get published. And it's okay. I feel like publishing shows you failures where there really aren't any, because every word that you write is a success. So that's kind of what I've had to learn over the last few years.
That's great. Kelly, your book took a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was hopefully the longest I'll ever spend on one book, I guess. So this was my third book, and that was published. But yeah, I mean, I started writing it, I think I was like 21 years old. And originally it was, you know, I've gone through so many drafts of it. I'm with you, Emiko. I feel like 6 revisions would be like a big victory. And I first started trying to publish it probably maybe 3 or 4 years into the writing process. And it was a really, in some ways, different industry back then. It's kind of a quiet book about Asian American teenagers. And at the time, I think no one really knew what to do with that. I think, you know, in recent years, there's been still not enough, but definitely more diversity in publishing. And I think publishers are telling a lot more stories that maybe wouldn't have been told years ago. And so at the time when I started publishing it, it was kind of like, this is like we're not really sure if there's an audience for it. One publisher was kind of like, you know, this can't really be a first book. You kind of have to like have a name for yourself before you try to publish a book like this. So I published 2 books for this. And then my agent, you know, we'd gotten so many rejections, and I was like, we're done, it's over. But she, you know, steadfastly believed in this book all along. And at some point she was like, I think it's time. And so we went out with it again. And yeah, it was a really different situation this time. There were, you know, multiple offers. It was, I think just the timing was better. And I think so many authors and orgs like WNDB have done a lot of work and really sort of broadened the imagination of what publishing can look like. And I feel really grateful for that. I feel like that's a huge reason why I was able to publish this book this last year.
That's great. Alexis, you told us a little bit about your process, but what did that look like? A little bit more detail.
Sure. So once I signed with Assemble, which is the production company, and that was a whole pre-process. So like I didn't even know that I was going to write a book until they were like, "Hey, we actually want you to write this book." So it was more of a directive, which I was happy about because I liked that structure. And I wrote the first 50 pages about the whole what is part one of this book is pretty unchanged to how it was, and we sold it on partial. I also got a 2-book contract with Bloomsbury, Emiko, and now I am terrified that the one I'm working on now is going to get rejected. I wasn't aware that was something that could happen. And now you put that in my head. So thank you. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. I'm scared. So I've got the 2-book deal, and then they bought it in like June 2019. The contract was finalized by around September because it was more complicated because the production company's rights and then their rights. It was a thank you to my agent for dealing with all of that. And so I had from September 2019 to about February 2020 to get my first draft in. So that was about 6 months to get the first part in. And then the world ended a little bit the month after. So all of the revising, I had like maybe 3 or 4, back and forth with over until about this January. No, even earlier, maybe like December. And that was just, maybe we should add something here. It was a very collaborative process, really like that. But it was I'm told a very fast turnaround for a first novel, at least. And I'm doing it all again right now. So it's a lot less of, my deadlines were a lot harder than I think most people with their first novels deal with, which worked out for me because I work better under pressure. But yeah, it was a lot more regimented and rapid than I'm told is common.
Alexis, what surprised you most about writing your first YA novel?
Oh, the fact that it happened, just because, I mean, in case you can't tell, like I hadn't intended to write a book. I've always wanted to write something, but to write this book has been like I loved working on it so much. I think just the most surprising thing for me was, I think when the text was finalized, and I realized that like I couldn't change anything else in there, even if I wanted to. And there was like a very strange sensation of, the Word document that's been on my desktop for a year and a half, that's a book now. That's a book? Like, no, that is a Google Doc. And then actually seeing it in 3 dimensions is still bananas. And I keep looking over at it. But yeah, the whole this was in my head and now it's something I can hold is a big trip for someone who's very visual and tactile like me.
That's great. How about you, Sheba?
So my publishing path, so in 2009, Skunk Girl came out, and what Kelly was referring to, like back in the old days, like it was the first YA novel with Muslim American protagonist and a Pakistani American protagonist. So, this was a long time ago. And then my next book came out in 2017, and in between I was working on other projects. I was working on a historical fiction novel for adults. I got married. I had my first kid. I was did a Fulbright in India. So many things happened, and I was writing the whole time. And then in 2017, I sold That Thing We Call Heart, and I got a 2-book contract. And the second one was Mariam Sharma of that contract. And then the Marvelous Mirza Girls, I started working on in 2017. I was really lucky. I got to spend all of 2018 living in Delhi and just working on the book, which was great, and not having to do anything else, which is a blessing. And then I think sometime in 2020, it was like it went into edit. So it's about 3 years to write that book. But I'd just like to echo what Emiko was saying, is, that almost every writer I know has written things that get rejected, don't end up getting published. And it in some sense, it feels like a failure in the way that you're a writer and you want to see something out in the world, and being published is like the goal. But everything you write, it shapes you as a writer, and it makes you a better writer. Even if you yourself write it and you're like, actually, I don't think this is working, I'm going to toss this, I'm not even going to submit it. just the process of like entering that imaginative world and writing sentences, it's like, you know, it's like practicing an instrument. Like it's not wasted. And so never to feel like if something you written didn't get published, or if you write it and you end up deciding that you don't want to go forward with it, it's not a waste. It's just part of your writing process, and it'll make you a better writer.
You said that much better than I did. Thank you. Thank you.
A lot of rejection too, right?
So I'm curious to ask you guys how you're feeling about the state of YA today. A couple of you guys have mentioned the difference between publishing your books now versus like 10 years ago, the kinds of changes you've seen in the industry. Do you feel like the changes you're seeing are for the better? Do you feel like they're going to stick? Do you feel like it's an authentic, meaningful change? I am specifically talking about diverse authors. Yes. But YA as a whole, it's been, you know, such a wild place to publish, with becoming so extraordinarily hot in the, you know, the Twilight era, Hunger Games, etc. And now I feel like it's coming to a more real and authentic and like sustainable place. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. So who wants to go first? Maybe I'll. Sheba, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So I think in terms of, obviously, the movement, the we need diverse books, and this progression from having almost like no diverse books to having like so many more options, so many more writers of color being published, is wonderful, right? Like I can't, and it's the only direction it should have gone in, right? I think what still concerns me is that I remember the exact like Lee and Low, the last statistic, but it was like 86% of like editors and like all the gatekeepers and even the marketing, you know, the marketing people, the people who work in publishing, the vast majority of them are still, you know, not people of color. And I think that really also has, for things to really change, I think the gatekeepers and the people who sort of are in power in publishing and who make the decisions, right? And I think a lot of people don't realize that, you know, if a publisher, you know, is publishing X amount of YA books, the marketing team often makes decisions on which books they're really going to push and which books they might not do as much for. And I think, you know, with writers of color, I think we could still sometimes run into an idea that the market can only support, you know, well, we can't have more than 3 Bangladeshi American YA books a year, because how much is the market going to buy, you know? So I think if the gatekeepers change, right, I think that will also start to change this attitude of, yeah, the market can support so many more like diverse stories than we're already publishing. And I know I've talked to other Asian Americans writers who kind of feel that fear of like this notion of like scarcity, and that, you know, they're only going to publish so much, and I hope it's one of mine. But that's not how it should be, right? We all need to like lift each other up. And I think ultimately we need more diversity, like, you know, in the editing and marketing, et cetera, teams. And that's when we're going to start to really see much more change. I think the authors have taken it really far, like with We Need Diverse Books. But then I think, you know, until the people at the top don't change, how much can really change?
Absolutely. And book selling too. This is something that we're talking about a lot and working on. Absolutely. Kelly, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Sheba. I think, yeah, it feels like maybe we've gotten through like level 1, sort of increasing like representation maybe, and then now looking at ways like where do we go from there? How do we go deeper than that? And I think your point about gatekeepers was really good. I was just looking up, I was remembering there was an article, it's from the New York Times about, and I remember one quote that stood out to me was, can't remember what publishing house it was, but when people were bidding on The Hate U Give, and one of the publishers was like, well, do we need an Angie Thomas? Will we have Jason Reynolds? And I feel like that mindset is like still kind of really pervasive. And yeah, just the idea that, you know, if you have one story about an Asian American teen, like how different can the next one be? Or, you know, kind of already filled that niche. So I feel like that's a big place where I hope we see more, I guess, change. And I think another thing that I feel like happens in YA is I feel like a lot of pigeonholing happens, and, you know, writers of various marginalizations they're either expected to write about their specific marginalization and in a way that's like authentic or like, you know, represents like everybody. And I think there's so much pressure in that. And yeah, I think there's that. And then I think also just the enormous, and I think this is just partly a numbers game too, just as there's still not, you know, we're still playing catch up, I think, on the numbers and the representation, just the pressure that authors feel about the single story or the few stories where you're like, well, if people are only going to read my book about like X, like how am I going to encompass like a whole range of experiences or, you know, represent everyone through my one story. So I think that's something that I would love to see lessen on authors, and just kind of knowing that your story is going to be one of like a rich tapestry of so many experiences that you're never responsible for, you know, the representation of like a whole group.
That's great. Alexis?
Well, I'm considerably newer to the genre and publishing, but I mean, I was a teen when Twilight came out. I think I was probably in like 9th or 10th grade. And so a lot of my like being in the YA demo years was transformed because when my sister was my age, she's 3 years older, like YA wasn't a huge thing. But we, like I said, we had Twilight, we had Hunger Games, we had Divergent, we had all this stuff. They were huge movies, they were huge books. And that was just the environment that I grew up in when it came to YA. And it was very homogenous as far as authors go, as far as protagonists go, as far as the stories go, is very, very straight, very, very white. And when, I mean, because my situation was unique in terms of getting my book deal specifically, I don't have too much firsthand experience, but I know that at least from talking to my friends who are writers, from just doing events like these, talking to other writers and looking at, you know, stats. I mean, there's incremental progress, which is progress like with like a little technicality tag on it. I think there's so much further people can go, but I mean, just the fact that there's so many more queer stories coming out. I mean, look at Casey McQuiston's One Last Stop. We've got, you know, time traveling subway lesbians. And I'm like, yes, I wish I had this YA book when I was, you know, 14, 15. So it's like now it exists and gets pushed sometimes, as opposed to you literally never, ever, ever see it, I think is progress, but incremental. I would love to see more of it. I hope to at least keep my career going so I can continue to fight for it. But it's been very eye-opening to suddenly to just kind of get rethrust back into YA after being shaped by it so much and being shaped by a very different version of the genre, and then being told now you have to write something for this sort of new edition of what YA means. That was a trip.
Emiko?
Yeah, so I echo everything that you ladies said. You know, personally, when I started, my debut came out in 2015 and it had a white protagonist in it. When I look back and I think about my entire childhood too, when I say this, I'd never read a book when I was little that featured a Japanese American character. I'd never read a book that was written by a Japanese American author. So when I entered publishing and I wanted to be a writer, I subconsciously believed that I could not get published if I didn't have a book with a white main character. So it was deliberate on my part after that book to only write Japanese American characters. And with that came a lot of pressure because although I'm hopeful about publishing, representation is still so scarce. So at the outset of both novels, Empress of All Seasons, which is like a Japanese historical fantasy, and Tokyo Ever After, which is a Japanese American contemporary, I thought, should I write this book do I deserve to write this book? Can I write this book? And I still get, it's fewer and far between, but emails about the book not being Japanese enough. And I think that just speaks still to the scarcity of representation, because everyone wants to have a book that's a reflection of themselves. And so we're not quite there yet. But it's better than what I remember, 40 years ago.
Beautiful. Thank you. This time is flying by. I think we have time for one more question, and we will end with the question that we like to end with, which is, what advice do you have for someone who wants to become a writer? Emiko?
Sure.
Or whoever is ready to go first.
So after my manuscript was passed on, by my first publishing house, I wrote 2 sticky notes, and I still have them on my desk. One of them says, "Don't give up," which is a little bit of a cliche, but so true for every writer. And then the other one says, "Fail and fail better." And I think that just goes back to, whatever you think is a failure is really a success, and just to keep going. And so that would be my advice to writers. And I'd also like to give every struggling writer a hug too, because I know how hard it is.
Alexis?
I feel like I touched on what I think is the advice that I give the most now that I'm someone who's asked to give advice about writing, which is endlessly funny to me. And that is that perfect is the enemy of done. Not even good. Perfect is the enemy of getting anything done. I am a huge perfectionist, and when I started writing, not even just the book, articles at work and in my career, I would get so hung up on every sentence, and as a result, I got almost nothing done. So just like finding a way to knock out the idea that every sentence has to be brilliant, and if it's not, you simply cannot progress to the next sentence. It's like, no, you can just bleh and let something out on the keyboard, and you can go back and fix it later if you need to. But the bleh is the important part, because that's actually writing. Spoiler alert, that's the writing part. And so that I think is something that a certain kind of writer would find it very difficult to internalize, and I'm definitely that kind of writer. And then my second bit of advice is be nice to yourself. Not even so much in like self-care, take baths or whatever. I'm really not good at that part either. But if possible, don't beat yourself up for not doing it, because then you're going to feel bad even when you do it. And it's really easy as writers to just, imagine and write in your head the perfect version of yourself who's writing the perfect novel and what it's going to be like when it happens. And it never actually happens that way. So just don't get mad when it doesn't. Like, don't get mad at yourself. It's not your fault. If you shake that away with the perfect thing, if possible, and just be as nice as possible, and try not to beat yourself up, because that makes it so much harder.
That's great. Kelly?
These are all such great pieces of advice. I think one of the really important things is having some clarity for yourself about who your audience is and who you're writing your books for. I think that especially as you get sort of further into, getting feedback from people and like agents and editors and publishers and just the industry in general, there are so many voices who are, reflecting your work back to you and sort of their own vision for where it'll go and who it'll be for and who it's going to speak to. And I think having a clear sense for yourself of who you're wanting to reach and what you're wanting to say is something that's really important to hold on to when you're sort of hearing all these other different visions for the work too. And I think just knowing, not every book is for every person, and just kind of thinking about what you want that sort of end goal to be, I think is really helpful for filtering out advice or suggestions or revisions or whatever that don't align with like the story you really wanted to tell or the people you really wanted to tell it to.
That's great. Sheba?
Yeah, I think My advice is to try to find like very good critique partners to read and critique your work. And I think this echoes kind of what Kelly said in terms of either those are people who are people you're writing to, so they would be in your audience, or if they're not your particular audience, they're very good readers of your work in that they understand what you are trying to do and what you are trying to say. Because I think, once you get on in your career and you have an agent, you have editors, and you might have like other readers, but when you're starting out, you really need those good readers who get what you're trying to do and who give you good critiques on your work. It's really vital. And the other thing I would say is, writing is really, I think the heart of writing is really revision. And I think beginning, when you're starting out, it can be frustrating because, like Alexis was saying, you think that your first draft is the story, and whereas, it could take, 10, 11, however many drafts. And so instead not to think of your first draft like as the story, but as you writing towards your story, I think is helpful because often, it takes many revisions for you to really figure out what the heart of your story is. And that's just, it's not that you're failing, it's part of the process.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much. This has been such a fantastic discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. It's great to meet everybody.
Yes, nice to meet everybody too. I've been seeing everybody's books floating around on Indie Next with Emiko, and I'm like, I hope I get to see her someday. And I did, so I win.
Yay. Well, I hope you can all make it to our store in person someday.
Me too.
Yeah, I hope so.
I will mention that our next Hudson Valley YA Society virtual event is going to be on Friday, July 23rd, 2021 at 7 p.m. Eastern with fantasy authors Kaylin Bayron, H.E. Edgman, and Bethany C. Morrow. And you can also find our past events on YouTube. You guys, this was a blast. Everyone should go right now and order these beautiful authors' books. You can order at oblongbooks.com or visit your local independent bookstore and ask them for these great, great novels. You guys, you're amazing. Thank you all so, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good weekend.